The pilot who refused to just watch. He was told not to fight, just to take photos. No guns blazing, no heroics, just fly high, snap reconnaissance pictures, and come home. But by the end of the war, that same pilot had destroyed 40 enemy planes, the highest kill count of any American airman in history. His name was Major Richard Bong, and while the world remembers him as a quiet farm boy from Wisconsin, the skies over the Pacific knew him as something else entirely, a phantom with twin engines and ice in his veins. They sent him up to observe. He came back a legend. In 1942, Bong was 22 years old, young, polite, the kind of man who'd apologize before shooting you down. He'd trained in the brand-new Lockheed P-38 Lightning, a twin-engine aircraft built for speed, altitude, and precision reconnaissance. His superiors told him his mission was simple. You'll fly photo runs. Record enemy installations. Avoid dogfights. The Pacific theater was chaos. Japan's Zero fighters ruled the skies, and Allied pilots were dying faster than replacements could arrive. Bong's orders were clear: gather intelligence, not glory. But Bong had a problem. He couldn't stand watching his squad mates go down. He'd fly side by side with fighter units on recon escort, his camera guns rolling, his hand resting just above the trigger. And every time he saw a Zero diving toward an American bomber, something in him snapped. In his first week, he broke formation twice. His commander grounded him. The third time, Bong returned with 3 kills in one sortie. When asked why he disobeyed, his answer was simple. "Sir, the photos looked better without enemy planes in them." That wasn't arrogance. It was instinct. And that instinct was about to rewrite every rule of aerial combat in the Pacific. By early 1943, Richard Bong's name was spreading through the Pacific like a myth. Pilots spoke of a P-38 that came out of nowhere, twin engines screaming, turning Japanese aces into smoke before they even saw him. The Japanese called the P-38 2 planes, 1 pilot. It climbed faster, dove harder, and could take hits the lightweight Zeros couldn't. But Bong used it differently. He didn't just fight head-on, he stalked. He'd climb high above enemy patrols, watching through his camera lens like a hunter through a scope. Then, without warning, he'd dive at 400 miles an hour, opening fire from just 100 yards, close enough to smell the burning fuel. In one mission over New Guinea, he shot down 6 enemy aircraft in a single day. 6. His commanding officer, General George Kenney, wanted to discipline him for ignoring orders again, but instead, he gave him a medal. "He's reckless," one report read, "but his recklessness saves lives." Every time Bong flew, the rest of his squadron felt safer. And every time he returned, the count climbed. 10 kills. 15. 20. He stopped being a recon pilot. He became the very thing his orders had tried to prevent: a weapon. But even weapons have limits. Because the more victories Bong earned, the more dangerous the skies became. Not from the Japanese, but from exhaustion, burnout, and guilt. He was turning into a symbol. And that's the kind of fame that could kill you faster than bullets. But what happened next would turn Bong from a war hero into something far more human, a man racing fate itself. By 1944, Richard Bong was no longer just a pilot. He was a legend in flight goggles. Newspapers back home called him the Ace of Aces. His face was on posters, his name on every military broadcast. But fame in wartime was a dangerous kind of fuel. The more his legend grew, the more everyone, the press, his commanders, even the enemy, wanted a piece of him. Japanese pilots began flying missions with one goal: find and kill Bong. Bounties were rumored. Squadrons hunted his P-38, scanning the skies for the silver lightning that had humiliated them again and again. And Bong, he was tired. He had survived hundreds of missions, dozens of dogfights, countless hours in the cockpit, each flight a gamble with fate. The Pacific sun burned his face. The constant roar of the twin engines filled his ears until even silence buzzed. Still, he couldn't stop, because each time he landed, there'd be another report. A bomber went down. A patrol never returned. And he'd look at the map, point to the next flight zone, and say, "I'll go." His commanders finally stepped in. They told him to take a break, to return to reconnaissance duties, safer flights, fewer kills, fewer headlines. Bong smiled politely. Then he ignored the order. On one of those photo missions, he spotted a formation of Zeros flying low over the jungle. He didn't call for backup. He didn't even radio in. He dove. 3 Zeros down in under 2 minutes. By the time he returned to base, his ground crew could barely recognize the P-38. Bullet holes peppered both wings. One engine was barely holding on. And yet Bong walked away smiling, brushing soot off his flight jacket like it was dust. A fellow pilot once said, he wasn't fighting for medals or glory. He just couldn't watch others die when he knew he could stop it. But with every victory, Bong was flying closer to something he couldn't outmaneuver, his own limits. His superiors grounded him again, this time for good. He had 40 confirmed kills, an unbreakable record. They told him to go home, to train new pilots, to rest. And for the first time in years, he did as he was told. But war has a cruel sense of irony. Because while the world celebrated him as a living hero, Bong's greatest battle was about to happen, not in the skies, but on the ground. And what happened next would prove that even the bravest men can't outrun fate. When Richard Bong finally returned home, America greeted him like a movie star. The war wasn't over yet, but his legend already was. He was the golden boy from Wisconsin, the farm kid who became the greatest fighter ace in U.S. history. Newspapers called him the Flying Farmer. Hollywood producers sent letters begging for interviews. Even President Roosevelt mentioned his name in speeches. But Bong didn't feel like a hero. He missed the sound of the engines, the sky, the adrenaline that made him feel alive. Down on the ground, everything seemed too quiet, too normal. He'd sit by the airfield for hours, watching planes take off and vanish into the clouds. His fiancée, Marjorie Vitendel, said he'd stare at the sky the way other men looked at old photographs, with longing and loss. He was only 24, but he'd already lived a dozen lifetimes. The Army tried to keep him busy. Publicity tours, training cadets, and air shows. But Bong hated the spotlight. When reporters asked him about the 40 kills, he shrugged. "I just happened to be there," he'd say. "Somebody had to do it." That humility wasn't an act. Bong never saw himself as better than anyone else. In fact, he carried guilt for every man he'd outlived, friends who hadn't made it home. He'd still write to their families, quietly, personally, sometimes in the middle of the night. So when he was offered a job as a test pilot for the U.S. Army Air Forces, it felt like the perfect middle ground, back in the air, away from the cameras. But it wasn't combat anymore. It was something riskier. Test flights in 1945 were brutal. Unproven planes, untested engines, experimental fuel systems. Pilots called it flying the unknown, and Bong loved it. It gave him that same rush, the same freedom, without the blood. Then, in August 1945, just days before Japan's surrender, Bong climbed into the cockpit of a new jet fighter, the Lockheed P-38 Shooting Star. It was one of the first jets the U.S. had ever built, fast and unpredictable. He ran the pre-flight checklist himself, calm, focused, Just another test flight. He took off into the California sky. Smooth at first, but at 300 feet, something went wrong. Witnesses said they saw the plane shudder, then dive. The engine had failed. Bong tried to eject, but the canopy jammed. At 24 years old, the most successful fighter pilot in American history was gone. And as fate would have it, the announcement of his death came just hours after the U.S. dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The war had ended. But for Richard Bong, it ended too soon. Back in Wisconsin, thousands of people lined the streets for his funeral. His P-38, Marge, named after his fiancée, flew overhead one last time. Marjorie stood in the front row, tears hidden behind dark glasses, holding the medal he'd earned for valor, the Medal of Honor. "He was the best of us," General Kenny said softly. And he wasn't wrong, because Bong's story wasn't just about a man who disobeyed orders. It was about someone who couldn't bear to live in a world where courage meant standing still. But there's one last part to his story, a twist that would keep historians arguing for decades. Because some believe Bong's record might not tell the full truth. Decades after Richard Bong's death, his name still carried the weight of myth. But as with every legend, whispers followed. Historians and aviation buffs began digging through old mission logs, combat reports, and flight records, and what they found blurred the line between fact and folklore. Yes, Bong had 40 confirmed kills. That number was beyond dispute. But among the countless stories told about him in the Pacific, one stood out. According to surviving pilots in his unit, there was a day when Bong wasn't supposed to fight at all. A routine photo reconnaissance mission, one he'd volunteered for because his P-38's camera mounts had just been installed. He was ordered to capture images of a Japanese convoy, nothing more. But when he arrived over the target, he found not a convoy, but a full fighter formation preparing to attack an Allied supply line. The order was clear: stay high, take your photos, get out. Instead, Bong rolled his Lightning over and dove straight into the swarm. 2 Zeros went down in seconds, then 3 more. By the time he pulled out of the dive, the sky behind him was littered with smoke and spiraling wrecks. His wingman's radio crackled with disbelief. "You were supposed to take pictures, Bong." To which he supposedly replied, calm as ever, "I did, just before I pulled the trigger." No camera film from that flight was ever recovered. Only the mission report, confirming 5 destroyed aircraft, and a reprimand that mysteriously disappeared from his record. Some historians dismiss the story as legend, a wartime exaggeration that blurred the truth. But others insist it fits his personality perfectly, the calm rebel who couldn't stand watching the enemy unhindered. And even now, veteran pilots tell that story with a kind of reverence, half believing it, half wanting it to be true. Because it wasn't really about photos or orders. It was about instinct. The unteachable drive to protect, to act, to do something, even when you're told not to. That's what made Richard Bong different. And that's what made him unforgettable. After his death, the U.S. Army Air Forces named an entire base in his honor, Bong Air Force Base, a rare tribute reserved for legends. His hometown built a memorial, and the P-38 he flew, Marge, was restored and displayed as a relic of courage. But the photo mission story never died. It appeared in declassified memos, in veteran interviews, in documentaries, always just outside the official record. Maybe it never happened. Or maybe, like so many things in war, it was one man's private rebellion that no one could fully prove. Either way, it fit the man perfectly. By the time the war ended, Bong had become the embodiment of a quiet truth. Heroes don't always follow orders. Sometimes, they break them for the right reason. He was never meant to be a killer. He was meant to be an observer. But history doesn't remember observers. It remembers the ones who act. In the end, Major Richard Bong's story wasn't just about 40 victories or medals pinned to his chest. It was about the impossible balance between duty and instinct, obedience and courage. The world ordered him to watch. He chose to fight, and because of that choice, countless Allied pilots lived to see the war's end. He never wrote a memoir. He never bragged, but his silence said everything. A farm boy who flew into history, not for fame, not for glory, but because he believed some things were worth defying orders for. And maybe, when the sky fell quiet at last, even he realized what every pilot eventually learns. You can be told to take photos, but sometimes the only picture worth remembering is the one where you stood your ground. Yindi.